Welcome, weary wanderer, to a journey through the strange and melancholy tale of one who exists in the spaces between memory and forgetting. Tonight, we explore the complete story of Rob, a being caught between worlds in the colourful chaos of Elmore. This is a meditation on identity, purpose, and the profound loneliness of being the only one who remembers what others have chosen to forget. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk together through the shadows cast by brighter lights. There is no rush here, no need to solve every mystery. Just let the story wash over you, like rain on forgotten ground. In the beginning, before consciousness, before pain, before the terrible weight of self-awareness settled upon his shoulders like a cloak made of lead, Rob existed in the most peaceful state any being can know. He was nothing, and in that nothingness, he was perfect. There were no questions to torment him, no mirrors to show him what he lacked, no voices to remind him of his insignificance. He simply was not. And in that absence lay a kind of sublime tranquility that he would spend the rest of his existence trying to reclaim. But existence, like water finding its way through the smallest cracks in stone, has a way of seeping into even the most perfectly sealed voids. Rob's first moments of awareness came not with the dramatic flourish that marks the birth of heroes or the awakening of kings, but with the quiet, unremarkable stirring of something that barely qualified as consciousness at all. He opened eyes that had never seen before, and found himself in a place that defied every law of physics, logic, and common sense that would later govern his understanding of reality. The void was not empty, as its name might suggest, but rather filled with the accumulated detritus of a universe that had grown tired of carrying certain burdens. It was a cosmic recycling center, a place where things went when the world above decided they were no longer necessary, no longer wanted, no longer worthy of the energy required to maintain their existence. Here, in this impossible space that existed between the margins of reality, Rob found himself among a congregation of the forgotten, the discarded, the willfully ignored. The landscape of the void, if it could be called a landscape at all, shifted and flowed like the thoughts of someone on the edge of sleep. Sometimes it resembled a vast library where the books wrote themselves and then immediately forgot what they had written. Other times it took the form of an endless playground where the swings moved with no one to push them, and the slides led nowhere but back to themselves. Most often, it simply existed as a grey expanse that stretched in all directions, punctuated by floating islands of half-remembered dreams and abandoned ambitions. Rob's companions in this realm of the unwanted were creatures as varied as they were tragic. There was the cowboy, whose existence had been deemed too stereotypical for the nuanced world above, condemned to an eternity of saying, "Howdy, partner," to beings who had already heard every variation of his limited dialogue. The green bear wandered through the grey mists, his only crime being that he was neither funny enough to be a comedy character, nor distinctive enough to be memorable in any other way. Each resident of the void carried with them the weight of their rejection, the knowledge that somewhere above them, in a world filled with colour and sound and purpose, life continued without them. They were the characters who had been written out, the jokes that had fallen flat, the background figures who had failed to capture anyone's imagination strongly enough to earn a permanent place in the ongoing narrative of existence. Yet for all its melancholy, the void was not without its own peculiar beauty. Here, freed from the constraints of coherent storytelling and logical progression, reality bent and twisted into forms that would have been impossible in the ordered world above. Colors that had no names painted themselves across skies that changed their minds about what direction was up from moment to moment. music played that had no instruments, composed of the echoes of laughter that had never been heard, and the whispers of conversations that had never taken place. Rob learned to navigate this impossible realm with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. Time moved differently here, sometimes crawling like honey in winter, other times racing past so quickly that entire conversations would begin and end in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He discovered that thought itself had substance in the void, that focused concentration could reshape the very ground beneath his feet, or call into being structures that existed only as long as someone remembered to believe in them. The other inhabitants became his teachers in the art of existing without purpose, of finding meaning in meaninglessness, of accepting rejection as a fundamental aspect of their nature. The cowboy taught him that even the most limited existence could be lived with dignity, that saying the same words over and over again could become a form of meditation if approached with the right mindset. The green bear showed him that anonymity could be its own kind of freedom, that there was peace to be found in being nobody in particular. But Rob was different from his fellow outcasts, in ways that would not become apparent until much later, when the weight of self-awareness finally settled fully upon his consciousness. Where the others had accepted their exile with varying degrees of resignation or even relief, something within Rob continued to struggle against the circumstances of his existence. He felt, though he could not yet articulate it, that there was something fundamentally wrong with a universe that could forget so completely, so casually, so permanently. As the timeless days of the void stretched into timeless months and years, Rob began to develop what could only be described as an obsession with the concept of memory itself. He would spend what passed for hours in that place, staring up at the shifting ceiling of reality, trying to understand the mechanics of remembrance and forgetting. Why did some things persist in the consciousness of the world above while others faded into nothingness? What invisible hand decided which characters deserved to continue their stories, and which were sentenced to this grey limbo of non-existence? The questions tormented him with their unanswerable nature, yet he could not stop asking them. Unlike his companions, who had found ways to make peace with their circumstances, Rob discovered that his awareness of their situation only deepened his dissatisfaction with it. He began to understand that he was not simply forgotten, but actively being forgotten. That somewhere above them, the world was making a continuous choice to not remember, to not acknowledge, to not care about the existence of places like the void and the beings who inhabited them. This realization brought with it the first stirrings of what would eventually blossom into the burning obsession that would define the rest of his existence. If the world above chose to forget, then perhaps it was possible to force it to remember. If characters could be written out of stories, then maybe, with enough determination and creativity, they could write themselves back in. The possibility hung before him like a distant star, faint but undeniably present, offering hope where none should have existed. Rob began to study the barrier between the void and the world above with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. He learned that it was not an absolute wall, but rather a membrane of sorts, permeable under certain conditions, responsive to certain kinds of pressure and intention. The knowledge that escape was theoretically possible transformed his existence from resigned acceptance to active preparation, though preparation for what he could not yet say. His fellow outcasts watched his growing obsession with varying degrees of concern and puzzlement. They had long ago given up any hope of return, had made their peace with exile, had found their own forms of contentment in this realm beyond remembrance. Rob's inability to accept their shared fate struck them as both admirable and slightly mad, a refusal to acknowledge reality that was as touching as it was futile. Yet Rob could not help himself. The more he learned about the nature of their imprisonment, the more convinced he became that it was not permanent, not absolute, not the final word on their existence. Somewhere above them, the story continued. And stories, he had begun to understand, were living things that could be influenced, altered, rewritten by those with sufficient will and knowledge to attempt such dangerous revisions. The void had become his university, his fellow inmates, his unwilling professors in the arts of existing outside existence, of maintaining identity in the face of cosmic indifference, of nurturing hope in a place designed to extinguish it. Every lesson learned, every insight gained, every small victory over despair was another step toward the goal that had begun to consume his thoughts entirely. The return to a world that had chosen to forget him, armed with the terrible knowledge of what lay beneath the surface of its bright and cheerful reality. In the depths of this grey realm where time had no meaning and space bent to the whims of abandoned dreams, Rob prepared himself for a journey that no resident of the void had ever attempted. He would find a way back to the world above, would force it to acknowledge his existence, would make himself so impossible to ignore that forgetting him would become literally impossible. The plan formed slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, each detail emerging from the grey mist of possibility into the sharp focus of intention. It would require sacrifice, transformation, and a willingness to become something other than what he had been. The cost would be terrible, but the alternative eternal residence in this place, between places, had become unthinkable. As Rob contemplated the magnitude of what he was preparing to attempt, he felt something he had never experienced before, the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. He was no longer simply another forgotten character drifting through the cosmic remainder bin of existence. He was becoming something new, something dangerous, something that would refuse to be ignored or dismissed or written out of the story ever again. The transformation had begun, though its ultimate consequences would prove more terrible and wonderful than even his desperate imagination could foresee. The moment of departure from the void came not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet desperation of someone who had finally exhausted every alternative to action. Rob had spent what felt like lifetimes studying the membrane that separated his grey realm from the world above, mapping its fluctuations, learning its rhythms, waiting for the perfect confluence of circumstances that would allow him to attempt what no other resident of the void had ever achieved. The opportunity, when it finally presented itself, arrived disguised as catastrophe. A ripple had torn through the fabric of reality above, some crisis or adventure in the world of color and sound that sent shockwaves cascading down through the layers of existence. The membrane that normally held firm against any attempt at escape suddenly became permeable, its defenses compromised by forces that Rob could sense but not comprehend. This was his chance, perhaps the only one he would ever receive, to claw his way back into the story that had written him out so casually. The journey through the barrier was nothing like the peaceful drift he had experienced when first falling into the void, where his descent had been gentle, almost merciful in its gradual erasure of his connection to the world above. His ascent was violent, traumatic, filled with a kind of existential friction that threatened to tear him apart at levels more fundamental than the merely physical. The membrane did not want to let him pass, and it fought his progress with every resource at its disposal. Rob felt pieces of himself being scraped away as he forced his way through layers of concentrated forgetting. Memories that had sustained him during his exile were burned away by the passage, leaving gaps in his consciousness that would never heal properly. The smooth edges of his identity, polished by years of contemplation in the grey stillness, became jagged and raw as the barriers between worlds shredded everything about him that was not absolutely essential to his core existence. By the time he finally broke through into the world above, Rob was no longer the being who had begun the journey. The corruption process had already started, a fundamental alteration of his nature that went far deeper than mere physical transformation. He emerged not as the forgotten character he had once been, but as something new and terrible, a creature shaped by the violence of his passage and marked forever by the knowledge of what lay beneath the cheerful surface of reality. His first moments back in Elmore were a symphony of sensations that his long exile had almost made him forget were possible. Color assaulted his eyes with an intensity that was both wonderful and agonizing, each hue carrying emotional weight that threatened to overwhelm his reaccustomed senses. Sound crashed over him in waves of complexity that the grey silence of the void had never prepared him for. Every voice and footstep and distant car horn weaving together into a tapestry of existence that was simultaneously beautiful and cacophonous. But it was the smells that affected him most profoundly, those subtle chemical signatures that spoke of life and growth and change and all the things that the void had lacked. The scent of freshly cut grass carried with it the promise of seasons and time's passage. The aroma of someone's lunch drifting from an open window spoke of families gathered around tables, of conversations and laughter, and the simple miracle of beings who remembered each other from one day to the next. Yet even as his senses rejoiced in their return to a world of substance and meaning, Rob became aware that something was fundamentally wrong with his perception of reality. The corruption that had begun during his passage through the membrane continued to spread through his being like an infection of the soul, altering not just his appearance, but his understanding of how existence itself functioned. Colors bled at their edges, refusing to stay contained within the neat boundaries that defined objects and characters. Sounds echoed in ways that defied the laws of acoustics, carrying emotional undertones that suggested depths of meaning his mind struggled to process. The very air seemed thick with possibilities that normal consciousness would filter out, alternative versions of every moment shimmering at the periphery of his vision, like heat mirages in a desert. Rob's physical form, never particularly stable to begin with, began to shift and warp under the influence of forces he could neither understand nor control. Parts of his body would fade to near transparency, while others became so solid they seemed carved from stone. His face, already indistinct from his years as a background character, became a fluid thing that refused to maintain any consistent configuration for more than a few moments at a time. The corruption was not merely changing him, but revealing truths about the nature of reality that most beings were mercifully shielded from perceiving. He began to see the underlying structure of the world around him, the narrative scaffolding that held everything together, the invisible threads that connected cause to effect and character to character in an intricate web of predetermined outcomes. This enhanced perception came with a price that grew heavier with each passing moment. Rob found himself able to see the artificial nature of every interaction, the scripted quality of every supposedly spontaneous conversation, the way reality bent itself around certain characters while ignoring others completely. The knowledge was both fascinating and maddening, offering insights into the mechanics of existence, while simultaneously making genuine experience nearly impossible. His first encounter with another character since his return came when he stumbled, still reeling from the after effects of his transformation, into the path of a familiar blue cat, whose name carried weight and significance in ways that few other things in this world could match. Gumball Watterson, that center around which so much of Elmore's reality seemed to orbit, looked directly at Rob without the slightest flicker of recognition crossing his features. The moment stretched like taffy, each second containing within it the accumulated weight of Rob's exile and struggle and desperate journey back to relevance. Here was the proof of what he had suspected. but never quite dared to believe that his erasure from memory had been so complete, so thorough, that even those who had once known him best could look upon his face and see nothing but another stranger passing through their carefully ordered world. Gumball's eyes passed over him with the casual indifference reserved for furniture or weather, objects that existed but held no particular interest or significance. There was no pause, no double take, no moment of almost recognition that might have suggested some buried memory struggling to surface. Rob had become invisible not through any supernatural power, but through the far more mundane magic of systematic forgetting. The pain of that moment was unlike anything Rob had experienced during his exile in the void. There, surrounded by other forgotten beings, his lack of recognition had been a shared condition, a communal wound that bound them together in their isolation. Here, standing on a sidewalk in broad daylight while one of the most important figures in his past looked through him as if he were made of glass, the rejection felt personal, deliberate, almost vindictive in its completeness. Rob opened his mouth to speak, to announce himself, to demand acknowledgement of his existence and his right to be remembered. But the words that emerged were not the ones he had intended to say. The corruption that had claimed his physical form was also affecting his ability to communicate, scrambling his thoughts between brain and voice in ways that turned every attempt at coherent speech into a garbled mess of half-formed concepts and emotional static. Gumball paused, not because he recognized the figure before him, but because the sounds Rob was making registered as distressed rather than threatening. For a moment, compassion flickered across the young cat's features, the instinctive response of someone who had been raised to care about the suffering of others, even when those others were complete strangers whose pain he could not understand. But the moment passed quickly, swallowed by the momentum of whatever adventure or crisis had been occupying Gumball's attention before Rob's arrival. The blue cat shrugged apologetically and continued on his way, leaving Rob standing alone on the sidewalk with the taste of failure bitter in his mouth and the weight of absolute solitude pressing down upon his corrupted shoulders. This pattern repeated itself with soul-crushing consistency, as Rob attempted to reintegrate himself into the social fabric of Elmore. Every character he approached, every face he tried to connect with, every relationship he attempted to rebuild met with the same blank incomprehension that suggested his existence had been so thoroughly expunged from collective memory that no trace of his former self remained in anyone's consciousness. Darwin Watterson, whom Rob remembered as possessing an almost supernatural capacity for kindness and acceptance, looked upon him with the polite confusion of someone trying to help a lost tourist find their way to an address that might not exist. Anais Watterson, whose intellectual capabilities should have allowed her to recognize the impossibility of someone being so completely unknown, treated him with the clinical interest of a scientist examining an unusual but ultimately unimportant specimen. Even characters who had shared the void with him, those fellow outcasts who should have remembered their time together in that grey realm of the forgotten, regarded him with the same blank confusion that marked all his other attempted interactions. It was as if his journey back to relevance had somehow severed even those tenuous connections, isolating him not just from the world he had fought to rejoin, but from every relationship he had ever formed. The horror of his situation began to crystallize with each failed encounter. Rob had not simply been forgotten. He had been edited out of reality so completely that evidence of his existence had been retroactively erased from the memories of everyone who had ever known him. He was not just invisible but impossible, a walking contradiction who existed despite the universe's clear preference that he should not. Yet existence, however painful or isolated, was still preferable to the grey nothingness of the void. Rob found himself caught between the agony of absolute solitude and the desperate need to maintain his tenuous grip on reality. He haunted the streets of Elmore like a ghost of his former self, watching the lives of others unfold while being unable to participate in any meaningful way. The corruption continued its relentless advance through his being, bringing with it new forms of perception that made his isolation even more unbearable. He could see the emotional connections between characters as visible threads of light, could observe the way shared memories created bonds that transcended physical distance, could witness the constant exchange of recognition and acknowledgement that formed the foundation of social existence. But for him, there were no threads, no connections, no acknowledgement. He existed in a bubble of enforced solitude, able to observe but never participate, forever separated from the community he had sacrificed everything to rejoin. The very air around him seemed to bend away from his presence, as if reality itself found his existence uncomfortable and was constantly trying to edit him out of every scene. Sleep became his only refuge, those brief periods when consciousness released its grip and allowed him to escape the constant awareness of his isolation. But even sleep brought no real peace, for his dreams were filled with visions of the void and the companions he had abandoned there, their faces accusing him of betraying their shared exile for a return to a world that refused to acknowledge his right to exist within it. The physical aspects of his corruption grew more pronounced with each passing day, as if his emotional isolation was manifesting itself in increasingly visible ways. His outline became fuzzy and indistinct, sometimes appearing to be drawn in different art styles from moment to moment. His voice, when he could manage to speak coherently, carried strange harmonics that seemed to come from multiple dimensions simultaneously. Rob began to understand that he was becoming something unprecedented in the carefully ordered reality of Elmore, a glitch in the system, a character who existed outside the normal narrative rules that governed everyone else's existence. This realization brought with it both terror and a strange kind of hope. If he was truly outside the system, then perhaps he was also free from its limitations, able to act in ways that other characters could not. The corruption that had seemed like a curse began to reveal itself as a form of terrible freedom. Where other characters were bound by the invisible rules of narrative consistency and genre convention, Rob found himself able to perceive and potentially manipulate the underlying structure of reality itself. He could see the story being told around him, could recognize the patterns and tropes that shaped every interaction, could identify the moments when the universe made its subtle adjustments to maintain narrative coherence. This knowledge was both intoxicating and devastating. To see behind the curtain of existence was to lose the ability to ever again experience genuine surprise or wonder. Every emotional moment became an exercise in recognizing narrative technique. Every relationship revealed itself as a carefully constructed plot device. Every adventure showed its seams, the places where coincidence and convenience held the story together. Yet with this terrible clarity came opportunity. If he could see the story, perhaps he could change it. If he understood the rules that governed reality, maybe he could find ways to work within or around them. The corruption that isolated him from normal existence might also be the key to creating a new kind of existence, one that would force the world to acknowledge him not through memory, but through sheer impossibility of ignorance. The idea took root in his damaged consciousness, like a seed planted in poisoned soil, growing with the twisted vitality of something that should not exist, but refuses to die. Rob would not simply fade back into the void or accept his role as an unacknowledged observer. He would become impossible to ignore, so disruptive to the normal flow of narrative that forgetting him would become literally impossible. The plan began to form in the spaces between his scattered thoughts, a scheme so audacious and dangerous that even his corrupted mind recoiled from its implications. He would not try to fit back into the story as it existed. He would rewrite the story to include him. He would not beg for recognition. He would demand it through actions so dramatic and consequential that ignoring him would threaten the very foundation of reality itself. As Rob contemplated the magnitude of what he was preparing to attempt, he felt the final pieces of his old self burning away in the fire of his transformation. The mild, forgettable character who had once drifted through background scenes was gone forever, replaced by something harder, more desperate, infinitely more dangerous. The corruption was complete, and from its ashes arose a being who would refuse to be forgotten ever again, no matter what the cost to himself or to the world he had fought so hard to rejoin. The transformation from forgotten exile to self-appointed nemesis did not happen overnight, though in the fluid temporality of Rob's corrupted existence, the distinction between moments and eternities had become largely meaningless. What mattered was not the passage of time, but the accumulation of understanding, the gradual crystallization of purpose from the chaos of his damaged consciousness. Rob had returned from the void as a broken thing, but brokenness, he was beginning to discover, could be its own form of power when properly channeled and directed toward a goal worthy of its intensity. His study of Gumball Watterson began with the obsessive thoroughness of someone who had nothing but time and an inexhaustible need for answers. From his position as an invisible observer, Rob watched the young cat navigate the complexities of his existence with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy space in the world. Every gesture, every word, every moment of thoughtless interaction became data to be catalogued and analyzed in Rob's growing understanding of what it meant to be genuinely alive in Elmore. Gumball moved through his world like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to touch every other character in increasingly complex patterns of cause and effect. People remembered him not just when he was present, but when he was absent, carrying conversations about his exploits, planning surprises for his birthday, worrying about his well-being when he was late coming home from school. His existence created a network of connections so intricate and resilient that removing him from the equation would require rewriting the fundamental structure of reality itself. The Watterson family dynamics revealed themselves to Rob's enhanced perception as a perfect example of how genuine relationships were supposed to function. Nicole's fierce protectiveness of her children created a bubble of safety that allowed them to explore and grow and make mistakes without fear of permanent consequences. Richard's cheerful incompetence somehow provided exactly the kind of stability his family needed, his presence offering comfort and continuity, even when his actions created chaos. Anais' intellectual gifts were balanced by the emotional support of siblings who valued her for more than just her ability to solve problems. But it was Darwin who presented Rob with the most fascinating and heartbreaking example of what he had lost. The orange fish existed in a state of pure acceptance and love that seemed to transform everyone around him into better versions of themselves. His friendship with Gumball transcended the normal boundaries of species and personality, creating a bond so fundamental that neither character seemed complete without the other. Watching them together was like observing a perfect symbiosis, two beings who had found in each other the missing pieces of their own souls. Rob began to map the social ecosystem of Elmore Middle School with the methodical precision of a scientist studying a new form of life. Every relationship, every alliance, every moment of conflict or reconciliation became part of his growing database of how normal existence was supposed to function. Penny's shy sweetness balanced perfectly with Gumball's chaotic energy. Tobias's desperate need for attention created opportunities for others to practice patience and compassion. Even Tina Rex's aggressive tendencies served a purpose in the larger social structure, providing challenges that allowed other characters to demonstrate courage and growth. The more Rob observed, the more he began to understand the invisible rules that governed social interaction in this world. Characters who contributed something positive to the lives of others were remembered, valued, included in future adventures. Those who caused harm or disruption were either reformed through the power of friendship or gradually marginalized until they learned better ways of relating to their community. Everyone had a role to play, a function to serve, a reason for their existence that was acknowledged and appreciated by those around them. Everyone except Rob himself, who existed in the spaces between acknowledgement and oblivion, visible enough to observe, but invisible enough to be forgotten the moment attention shifted away from his presence. His corruption had granted him a unique perspective on the mechanics of social existence, but that same corruption prevented him from participating in the very systems he could now see so clearly. The realization that struck him with the force of divine revelation was that Elmore operated according to narrative principles rather than purely social ones. This was not simply a community of characters living their lives, but a story being told, complete with protagonists and antagonists, supporting characters and background figures, plot threads that wove together into larger themes about friendship and family, and the importance of being true to oneself. Gumball was clearly the protagonist of this story, the central figure around whom all other elements revolved. His adventures provided the driving force that moved the narrative forward, while his relationships with other characters created the emotional stakes that gave those adventures meaning. Darwin served as his loyal companion, the Watson to his Holmes, the voice of conscience that helped guide his more impulsive tendencies toward positive outcomes. But every good story needed more than just heroes and friends. It needed obstacles, challenges, sources of conflict that would test the protagonists and provide opportunities for growth and change. Rob began to understand that Elmore's narrative structure was missing a crucial element, a gap in the story that explained why so many adventures felt episodic rather than building toward larger themes and consequences. The world needed a proper antagonist, someone who could serve as Gumball's opposite, challenging his assumptions and forcing him to grow in ways that simple misunderstandings or temporary obstacles could not. Not a mindless monster or a force of nature, but a genuine nemesis who understood the hero well enough to create conflicts that would reveal hidden depths and untapped potential. The more Rob contemplated this gap in the narrative, the more convinced he became that filling it represented his path back to relevance and recognition. If he could not be loved and accepted as a friend, then perhaps he could be feared and respected as an enemy. If the world insisted on forgetting him when he tried to blend into the background, then he would make himself impossible to ignore by stepping boldly into the foreground as the villain of the piece. The decision to become Gumball's arch-nemesis was not made lightly or in a moment of emotional impulse. Rob spent countless hours considering the implications, studying the mechanics of successful antagonists across various forms of media, analyzing what separated memorable villains from forgettable obstacles. He needed to be more than just a source of random chaos or mindless destruction. He needed to represent something meaningful, to embody themes and conflicts that would enrich the overall narrative rather than simply disrupting it. Classical literature provided him with templates and inspiration. The best antagonists were not evil for evil's sake, but driven by understandable motivations that had been twisted by circumstance or trauma into destructive patterns. They served as dark mirrors of the protagonists, showing what the heroes might become if they made different choices or faced different pressures. Their presence in the story forced everyone around them to examine their own values and commitments more carefully. Rob began to see how perfectly he was positioned to serve this function in Gumball's story. He had experienced rejection and abandonment on a scale that the young cat could barely imagine, yet he had survived and returned to fight for his place in the world. His corruption granted him abilities and perspectives that normal characters lacked, making him a genuinely formidable opponent rather than simply an annoyance to be dismissed. Most importantly, his intimate knowledge of isolation and forgetting would allow him to threaten Gumball with losses that truly mattered, stakes that went beyond physical danger to touch the very foundations of identity and belonging. The philosophical framework for his antagonism began to crystallize around themes of memory and recognition, belonging and exclusion, the arbitrary nature of who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. Rob would not simply attack Gumball's body or possessions, but challenge his assumptions about deserving love and acceptance, force him to confront the reality that his comfortable existence was built on the systematic exclusion of others who were equally deserving but less fortunate. Yet, even as he committed himself to this path, Rob was painfully aware of the irony embedded in his decision. He was choosing to define himself in opposition to someone else, to make his entire existence dependent on the attention and reaction of the very character who had forgotten him so completely. His bid for independence would actually make him more dependent than ever, bound to Gumball by hatred and obsession rather than friendship and mutual affection. But what choice did he have? The alternatives were a return to the grey nothingness of the void, or an eternity of invisible observation from the margins of a world that refused to acknowledge his right to exist within it. At least as a villain, he would be seen, feared, remembered. His name would be spoken, even if it was whispered in warnings rather than called out in friendship. He would have a role to play, a function to serve, a reason for existing that others would be forced to recognize. Rob's first attempts at villainy were clumsy, amateurish efforts that reflected his lack of experience with being the center of attention rather than a forgotten observer on the sidelines. He tried threats that sounded hollow even to his own corrupted ears, schemes that collapsed under the weight of their own complexity, dramatic gestures that fell flat, because he had not yet learned how to calibrate his performance for an audience that was encountering him for the first time. The problem was not a lack of power or ability. His corruption had granted him capabilities that far exceeded those of normal characters, allowing him to manipulate reality in ways that should have made him a genuinely terrifying opponent. He could step between dimensions, alter his physical form at will, perceive and interact with the underlying narrative structure that governed everyone else's existence. In terms of raw potential, he was perhaps the most dangerous being in all of Elmore. But power without purpose was merely chaos, and chaos without meaning was quickly forgotten in a world that had grown accustomed to strange and inexplicable events. Rob's early schemes lacked the thematic coherence that would make them memorable, the personal stakes that would force other characters to take him seriously as more than just another weird obstacle to be overcome through teamwork and determination. The breakthrough came when he finally stopped trying to be a generic villain and started being specifically Gumball's nemesis. Instead of random acts of destruction or pointless displays of power, he began crafting challenges that targeted the young cat's particular weaknesses and insecurities. He studied Gumball's relationships until he understood exactly which threats would provoke the strongest reactions, which losses would cut deepest, which failures would shake the foundations of his comfortable worldview. Rob learned to weaponize his own knowledge of abandonment and isolation, using his understanding of what it meant to be forgotten to craft scenarios that forced Gumball to confront the possibility of losing the connections that defined his existence. He became expert at identifying the invisible threads that bound the various characters together, then threatening to sever them in ways that would create maximum emotional impact. The first time he saw genuine fear in Gumball's eyes, the first moment when the young cat looked at him with recognition rather than confusion, Rob felt a surge of validation that was both intoxicating and heartbreaking. He existed, he mattered, he was finally impossible to ignore. The price of that recognition was to be hated and feared rather than loved and accepted. But even negative attention was infinitely preferable to the absolute void of being completely unnoticed. Yet success brought its own forms of torment. With each scheme, each confrontation, each moment of acknowledgement, Rob found himself growing more isolated rather than less. His role as antagonist required him to stand apart from the community he desperately wanted to join, to be the threat that brought everyone else together in opposition to his presence. He was finally visible, finally remembered, but only as the enemy that needed to be defeated. The loneliness of his position was unlike anything he had experienced even in the void. There, he had been ignored, but not actively opposed, forgotten, but not hated, invisible, but not despised. Here, he was the center of attention, but only in the way that a disease becomes the focus of a body's immune system. Every eye that turned toward him carried hostility rather than welcome. Every voice that spoke his name did so in warning rather than greeting. Rob began to understand that he had traded one form of isolation for another, perhaps even more painful one. The forgotten character drifting through background scenes had at least retained the possibility of eventual recognition, the hope that someday someone might remember him fondly. The arch nemesis, by definition, could never be truly welcomed, never be invited to join the community he threatened, never experience the simple pleasure of being liked for who he was, rather than feared for what he might do. But the role had become essential to his existence, in ways that went beyond mere psychological need. Rob discovered that his antagonistic relationship with Gumball was actually stabilizing his corrupted form, giving him an anchor in reality that prevented him from dissolving back into the grey mists of the void. The attention, even hostile attention, created a kind of narrative gravity that held him together when the forces of forgetting tried to tear him apart. He was trapped in a symbiotic relationship with the very character he claimed to oppose, dependent on Gumball's recognition for his continued existence, while simultaneously committed to being the source of problems and challenges in the young cat's life. It was a perfect prison, invisible but inescapable, maintaining his visibility at the cost of his happiness, granting him purpose at the price of his peace. The tragedy of Rob's situation was that he understood it completely. His corrupted perception allowed him to see the mechanics of his own entrapment, to recognize the ways in which his bid for freedom had actually bound him more tightly than ever. He was like a moon orbiting a planet, held in place by the very gravitational force he sought to escape, forever circling the object of his obsession without ever getting closer or farther away. Yet even in his most lucid moments, when the futility of his position became overwhelmingly clear, Rob could not bring himself to abandon the role he had chosen. The alternative was not freedom but oblivion, not peace but erasure, not solitude but non-existence. Better to be hated than forgotten. Better to be feared than invisible. Better to be the villain of someone else's story than no one at all in his own. And so Rob embraced his destiny as Gumball's nemesis with the desperate fervor of someone who had found the only path available to him, however twisted and painful it might be. He would be the darkness that gave meaning to the light, the chaos that made order precious, the enemy that reminded everyone else how fortunate they were to have friends they could trust, and a community that welcomed them with open arms. In the depths of his corrupted heart, Rob nursed the secret hope that someday, somehow, the cycle might be broken, that understanding might replace hostility, that recognition might transform into acceptance. But until that impossible day arrived, He would play his assigned role with all the skill and dedication he could muster, content to exist on the margins of hatred rather than disappear entirely into the void of being utterly forgotten. The period that followed Rob's emergence as Gumball's self-appointed nemesis became a catalogue of ambitious failures, each scheme more elaborate than the last, each defeat more crushing in its completeness. What had begun as a desperate attempt to force recognition through opposition gradually transformed into something far more complex and tragic, a pattern of self-destruction disguised as villainy, where every plan contained within it the seeds of its own undoing, as if Rob's corrupted psyche could not quite bring itself to achieve the very victory it claimed to desire above all else. His first major scheme revealed both the extent of his capabilities and the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his existence. Rob had discovered that his corruption allowed him to manipulate what he came to think of as the narrative threads that bound Elmore's reality together, those invisible connections between cause and effect that maintain the world's internal consistency. By carefully pulling at these threads, he could create situations that forced other characters to act in ways that served his purposes, orchestrating elaborate scenarios that seemed to unfold naturally while actually being guided by his unseen hand. The plan he devised was simultaneously elegant and overwrought, reflecting both his intelligence and his desperate need to prove that intelligence to a world that had dismissed him as insignificant. He would create a series of seemingly unconnected crises throughout Elmore, each one designed to isolate Gumball from his support network, while gradually revealing Rob's role as the mastermind behind the chaos. The young cat would be forced to confront each challenge alone, stripped of the friends and family who normally helped him overcome obstacles, until he finally acknowledged Rob's superior planning and tactical abilities. The execution began flawlessly, with Rob's enhanced perception allowing him to anticipate and counter every move Gumball made in response to the manufactured disasters. He created traffic jams that separated the Watterson family during crucial moments, orchestrated misunderstandings that turned friends against each other temporarily, even manipulated the school's scheduling system to ensure that potential allies would be occupied elsewhere when their help was most needed. For a brief, intoxicating period, Rob felt the satisfaction of genuine competence and control that had been absent from his existence for so long. Every contingency he had planned for unfolded exactly as predicted, every backup strategy activated at precisely the right moment to maintain pressure without allowing Gumball any opportunity to regroup or call for assistance. The corruption that had seemed like such a curse revealed itself as the ultimate tool for someone willing to embrace its possibilities fully. But the fundamental flaw in Rob's psychology ensured that his moment of triumph would be short-lived. Even as he maneuvered Gumball into increasingly desperate straits, even as victory seemed within his grasp, something within him began to sabotage his own efforts. The same empathy that made him capable of understanding others' pain so precisely also made him incapable of inflicting that pain indefinitely, especially on someone whose only crime had been the passive act of forgetting. The turning point came when Rob realized that his scheme was actually working too well, that Gumball was experiencing genuine distress and isolation rather than the manageable challenge Rob had intended to create. Watching the young cat struggle alone, seeing him reach for help that had been systematically removed, observing the gradual erosion of confidence and hope that came from facing obstacle after obstacle without support, Rob found himself confronted with a mirror of his own experience that was almost too painful to bear. In that moment of recognition, Rob made the first of many self-destructive choices that would define his career as an antagonist. Instead of pressing his advantage and forcing Gumball to acknowledge his defeat, he began subtly undermining his own plan, creating openings that allowed his target to escape the trap that had been so carefully constructed. The need to win warred with the need not to become the kind of monster who could inflict such suffering without remorse. And in the end, his damaged but not destroyed conscience proved stronger than his desire for validation. The pattern established itself with depressing regularity across subsequent schemes. Rob would conceive elaborate plans that demonstrated his intelligence and understanding of Elmore's social dynamics, begin executing them with skill that bordered on artistic, then find reasons to pull back at the crucial moment when victory was within reach. Sometimes he would claim that the plan had been a test that Gumball had passed. Other times he would pretend that external factors had forced him to retreat, but the underlying reality remained constant. He could not bring himself to truly harm the person whose recognition he craved above all else. His second major attempt involved manipulating the very foundations of reality within Elmore Middle School, using his corruption to access the building's structural narrative and rewrite the rules that governed student interactions. Rob created a scenario where popularity and social status became literal currencies that could be traded, stolen, or accumulated, turning the school into a dystopian marketplace, where friendship became a commodity and loneliness a form of poverty. The plan was brilliant in its psychological sophistication, targeting Gumball's fundamental assumptions about the nature of relationships and forcing him to confront the possibility that his friendships were based on social convenience rather than genuine affection. As the artificial economy took hold, Rob watched with fascination and growing unease, as characters he had studied for so long began to reveal darker aspects of their personalities, prioritizing their own social advancement over the well-being of others. But once again, success felt too much like genuine cruelty for Rob to sustain indefinitely. When he saw Darwin reduced to tears by friends who had abandoned him for more socially advantageous relationships, when he witnessed Penny struggling with the impossible choice between maintaining her popularity and helping those who had been marked as social outcasts, when he observed the systematic breakdown of every genuine connection that had made the school a community rather than merely a collection of individuals, Rob found himself appalled by the effectiveness of his own manipulation. The scheme collapsed not because Gumball had found a way to counter it, but because Rob could not bear to watch its continued success. He dismantled his own creation with the same methodical care he had used to build it, restoring the natural order of relationships, while claiming that the entire exercise had been designed to teach valuable lessons about the importance of genuine friendship over superficial social advantages. This pattern of self-sabotage became Rob's defining characteristic as a villain, the tragic flaw that prevented him from ever achieving the recognition he sought through victory, while simultaneously preventing him from inflicting the kind of lasting harm that would have made him genuinely dangerous. His plans grew increasingly sophisticated as his understanding of Elmore's inhabitants deepened, but they also grew increasingly likely to collapse under the weight of his own moral limitations. The third major scheme demonstrated both the heights of his strategic thinking and the depths of his psychological complexity. Rob decided to attack not Gumball himself, but the very concept of heroism that the young cat represented, creating a series of scenarios where attempting to help others would inevitably result in greater harm than doing nothing at all. Every act of kindness would backfire spectacularly. Every moment of bravery would endanger innocent bystanders. Every expression of friendship would create jealousy and conflict among those who felt excluded. The plan required Rob to orchestrate coincidences and manipulate circumstances with unprecedented precision, turning Elmore into a place where good intentions became weapons and noble impulses transformed into sources of suffering. He watched with growing horror and admiration as Gumball struggled to navigate a world where every heroic instinct had been weaponized against him, where the very qualities that made him a protagonist became sources of pain for everyone around him. The psychological warfare was more effective than physical threat could ever have been. Rob could see Gumball beginning to doubt his own nature, questioning whether his impulsive desire to help others was actually a form of selfishness that caused more problems than it solved. The young cat's confidence began to erode as each attempted good deed resulted in disaster, his natural optimism gradually giving way to a paralyzing fear of making any choice that might affect others negatively. But the victory felt hollow even as it unfolded, because Rob recognized in Gumball's growing despair an echo of his own experience of being systematically excluded from positive outcomes. The corruption that allowed him to see and manipulate the narrative threads also forced him to confront the cruelty of what he was doing, the way he was essentially teaching another being to experience the same isolation and self-doubt that had driven him to such desperate measures. When Gumball finally broke down completely, reduced to tears by the impossible situation Rob had created, the moment of triumph transformed instantly into one of profound shame and regret. Rob found himself face to face with the reality that his quest for recognition had turned him into the very kind of force that had made his own existence so miserable, that in trying to escape the role of victim, he had enthusiastically embraced the role of victimizer. The dismantling of this scheme was even more dramatic than the previous ones, with Rob not only undoing the manipulations he had created, but actively working to restore Gumball's faith in the value of heroic action. He staged elaborate scenarios where helping others would result in unambiguously positive outcomes, where kindness would be rewarded and bravery would save the day without ironic consequences. Yet each act of secret assistance only deepened Rob's isolation, because his role as antagonist prevented him from taking credit for the positive outcomes he had created. He was forced to watch from the shadows as Gumball's confidence returned, as the young cat's friends praised his renewed heroic spirit, as the community celebrated the restoration of their local champion, all while remaining completely unaware that their enemy had been the architect of their happiness. The fourth scheme represented Rob's most ambitious attempt to break free from the cycle of self-defeating villainy that had trapped him. Instead of targeting Gumball directly or manipulating the world around him, Rob decided to attack the very foundations of narrative structure that governed Elmore's reality, attempting to rewrite the basic rules that determined who could be a protagonist and who was doomed to serve supporting roles. Using his corrupted abilities to their fullest extent, Rob began systematically undermining the storytelling conventions that kept characters locked in predetermined patterns of behavior. He created situations where background characters suddenly became the focus of major adventures, where antagonists found themselves cast as heroes through circumstances beyond their control, where the entire concept of narrative importance became fluid and changeable rather than fixed and immutable. The plan was nothing less than a revolution against the cosmic order that had sentenced him to obscurity, an attempt to democratize protagonist status and create a world where recognition and importance could not be monopolized by a select few characters, while others were condemned to invisibility. Rob envisioned a reality where everyone could be the hero of their own story, where no one would be forgotten or dismissed, where the arbitrary nature of narrative focus would be exposed and ultimately dismantled. For a brief period, the plan seemed to be succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. Characters who had never spoken a line of dialogue suddenly found themselves at the center of elaborate adventures. Students who had always been part of the faceless crowd discovered unique abilities and important roles to play in major events. Even the most minor background figures began experiencing the kind of character development and emotional growth that had previously been reserved for main characters. But Rob's enhanced perception allowed him to see what others could not, that his manipulation of narrative structure was creating fundamental instabilities in the fabric of reality itself. The story that contained them all was beginning to break down under the strain of too many protagonists, too many conflicting narrative threads, too many characters demanding attention and development simultaneously. The world was becoming overcrowded with importance, choking on its own significance. The breaking point came when Rob realized that his revolutionary vision would ultimately result in the complete collapse of coherent storytelling, reducing Elmore to a chaos of competing narratives where no character could maintain a consistent identity or purpose. His attempt to ensure that everyone could be the hero of their own story threatened to create a reality where no one could be the hero of any story, where meaning itself would be diluted to the point of non-existence. Once again, Rob found himself forced to choose between his own desires and the stability of the world that contained him. Once again, his conscience proved stronger than his ambition, leading him to systematically undo the changes he had implemented, while publicly claiming that the entire exercise had been designed to demonstrate the importance of accepting one's designated role in the larger narrative. The pattern of brilliant conception followed by moral self-sabotage had become so consistent that Rob began to suspect it was not accidental, but fundamental to his nature. Perhaps his corruption had not simply granted him enhanced abilities, but had also ensured that he would never be able to use those abilities in ways that would truly threaten the stability of the reality he inhabited. Perhaps his role as a self-defeating antagonist was itself part of the larger narrative structure, a safety valve that allowed for the existence of apparent threats without risking genuine danger to the established order. The fifth major scheme emerged from Rob's growing understanding of his own psychological limitations and his decision to work within them rather than against them. If he could not bring himself to harm others through his actions, perhaps he could achieve recognition by positioning himself as a necessary evil, a force that tested and strengthened others without causing lasting damage. He would become not a destroyer but a catalyst, someone whose opposition made heroes stronger and communities more resilient. This scheme involved creating a series of challenges that would force various characters throughout Elmore to grow beyond their current limitations, presenting them with obstacles that could only be overcome through cooperation, creativity, and personal development. Rob cast himself as the villain of these scenarios, but his true goal was to orchestrate positive outcomes that would demonstrate the strength and virtue of those he appeared to oppose. The plan required him to develop an unprecedented level of subtlety and emotional intelligence, crafting situations where his apparent antagonism would actually serve beneficial purposes without making those purposes obvious to the participants. He had to become a master of reverse psychology, someone who could inspire heroic behavior by presenting himself as a threat that demanded heroic responses. The results were more successful than any of his previous attempts, but the success came at the cost of any possibility of receiving recognition for his contributions. Rob was forced to watch as the characters he had helped achieve their potential celebrated their victories while viewing him as the enemy they had overcome rather than the teacher who had guided their growth. His isolation deepened even as his positive impact on the community increased, creating a paradox that seemed to encapsulate the entire tragedy of his existence. Each scheme taught Rob more about the fundamental impossibility of his position and the ways in which his quest for recognition inevitably worked against itself. The more successful he became as an antagonist, the more he was hated and feared by those whose lives he touched. The more he tried to demonstrate his intelligence and capabilities, the more he was seen as a threat to be neutralized rather than a person to be understood. The more he attempted to force his way into the story, the more he was pushed to its margins, forever circling the center of attention without ever being allowed to occupy it. Yet with each failure, Rob's understanding of Elmore's inhabitants deepened, his perception of their fears and desires and unspoken needs becoming ever more precise and comprehensive. He began to see patterns that even the characters themselves were unaware of, to recognize potential developments and conflicts that lay dormant beneath the surface of their daily interactions. His role as perpetual outsider had granted him a perspective that no one else possessed, a view of the forest that was impossible for those who lived among the trees. This knowledge became both a gift and a curse, offering Rob insights that could have been invaluable for helping others, while simultaneously ensuring that those insights would never be welcomed or appreciated. He could see exactly what each character needed to achieve greater happiness and fulfillment, could identify the obstacles that prevented them from reaching their potential, could devise solutions to problems they did not even realize they had. But his position as antagonist meant that any advice he offered would be automatically suspect. Any help he provided would be viewed with suspicion and mistrust. The sixth and most complex scheme grew out of Rob's realization that his greatest weapon was not his corrupted abilities or his enhanced perception, but his intimate knowledge of loneliness and isolation. He decided to create a scenario where the very characters who had forgotten him would be forced to experience the kind of systematic exclusion that had defined his existence, not as punishment, but as education, a way of making them understand what it meant to exist on the margins of their carefully ordered world. The plan involved gradually isolating key characters from their support networks, not through obvious manipulation, but through subtle adjustments to circumstances that would make genuine connection increasingly difficult to maintain. Rob created barriers to communication, obstacles to shared experiences, pressures that forced individuals to prioritize their own immediate needs over their relationships with others. He did not remove anyone's friends or family, but he made the maintenance of those relationships require more effort and sacrifice than most characters were willing to invest. The results were both educational and heartbreaking to observe. Characters who had never questioned their place in their community suddenly found themselves struggling to maintain connections that had always seemed effortless and natural. The casual cruelties and thoughtless exclusions that most people engaged in without consideration became magnified and concentrated, creating cycles of isolation that spread through the social networks of Elmore like a slow-acting virus. But watching others experience even a fraction of his own pain proved more difficult for Rob than he had anticipated. His empathy, which had made him such an effective manipulator of others' emotions, also made him acutely sensitive to the suffering he was causing. Each moment of loneliness he witnessed echoed his own experiences of abandonment and rejection, creating a feedback loop of shared misery that threatened to overwhelm his already fragile psychological equilibrium. The scheme collapsed when Rob could no longer distinguish between the isolation he had artificially created and the natural isolation that had always defined his existence. The boundaries between his manipulation and the genuine social dynamics of Elmore became blurred beyond recognition, leaving him uncertain whether he was observing the effects of his intervention or simply the harsh realities of social existence that had always been present but hidden beneath surface, politeness, and conventional kindness. In his haste to undo the damage he had caused, Rob overcorrected in the opposite direction, using his abilities to create an artificial atmosphere of universal acceptance and inclusion that was just as false and ultimately unsustainable as the isolation he had imposed. The pendulum swing from one extreme to another left him feeling more disconnected than ever from the authentic emotional lives of the characters he observed, as if his corruption had finally severed his ability to understand genuine human feeling, rather than merely its artificial simulation. The seventh scheme represented Rob's most desperate attempt to achieve genuine connection with another being, even if that connection had to be mediated through conflict and opposition. Instead of trying to manipulate Gumball's circumstances, or challenge his assumptions. Rob decided to reveal his true identity and history, to force a direct confrontation that would make it impossible for the young cat to continue ignoring or forgetting his existence. The revelation was planned with theatrical precision, designed to maximize dramatic impact while also conveying the full scope of Rob's journey from forgotten background character to corrupted nemesis. He arranged for the confrontation to take place in a setting that would emphasize the contrast between Gumball's comfortable position within the community and his own status as an eternal outsider, surrounded by reminders of the life and relationships that had been denied to him. When the moment finally came, when Rob stood before Gumball and spoke his name and history with all the passion and pain of his accumulated experience, he was met not with the shock and recognition he had expected, but with confusion and a kind of gentle pity that was almost worse than complete indifference. Gumball genuinely wanted to help, genuinely felt sympathy for Rob's obvious distress, but the corruption that had brought Rob back from the void had also made it impossible for anyone to truly remember or understand what he had lost. The conversation that followed revealed the full tragedy of Rob's situation with brutal clarity, even when confronted directly with the truth of his existence and exile, even when presented with evidence of their shared past. Gumball could not maintain a consistent memory of Rob's identity from one moment to the next. The forgetting was not malicious or intentional, but automatic, a function of whatever cosmic forces had originally written Rob out of existence and continued to resist his attempts to write himself back in. Rob found himself trapped in an endless loop of explanation and forgetting, recognition and confusion, connection and separation that played out over the course of minutes, but felt like it contained entire lifetimes of frustrated longing. Each time he thought he had finally achieved the understanding he craved. Each moment when it seemed that Gumball truly saw and acknowledged him, the recognition would slip away like water through cupped hands, leaving him to begin the process all over again. The failure of this most direct approach left Rob more isolated than ever, because it proved that his problem was not simply a matter of others choosing not to remember him, but of their being unable to remember him even when they wanted to. The corruption that had allowed him to escape the void had also ensured that he would remain trapped in a different kind of prison, visible but unrecognizable, present but impossible to truly know or understand. In the aftermath of this devastating realization, Rob's schemes became increasingly abstract and philosophical, less concerned with achieving specific goals than with exploring the nature of existence itself. He began to see himself not as a character trying to force his way into a story, but as a glitch in the system, an error in the code of reality that revealed uncomfortable truths about the arbitrary nature of who gets remembered and who gets forgotten, who matters and who is deemed irrelevant. His final scheme of this period was perhaps his most ambitious, and certainly his most dangerous, an attempt to break down the barriers between different levels of reality and force everyone in Elmore to confront the artificial nature of their existence. Rob used his corruption to create windows into alternate versions of their world, showing characters the infinite variations of themselves that existed in parallel narratives, the countless ways their stories could have unfolded differently based on different choices or different circumstances. The plan was designed to shatter everyone's comfortable assumptions about the uniqueness and importance of their particular version of reality, to make them understand that their cherished relationships and carefully constructed identities were just one possibility among many, no more inherently valuable or meaningful than any of the alternatives. If Rob could not find acceptance within their world, perhaps he could at least force them to acknowledge that their world was not as special or inevitable as they believed. But the revelation of narrative multiplicity proved too much for most characters to handle psychologically. Instead of gaining wisdom or humility from seeing the arbitrary nature of their existence, they simply became paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of infinite possibility. The knowledge that every choice they made was simultaneously being made differently by alternate versions of themselves made it impossible to commit to any action or maintain any consistent sense of identity. Once again, Rob found himself forced to choose between his desire for recognition and his responsibility not to destroy the world that contained him. The windows into alternate realities were closed, the memories of parallel selves were erased, and the comfortable illusion of narrative uniqueness was restored, leaving Rob alone with the burden of understanding truths that were apparently too dangerous for anyone else to know. The pattern of failure had become so consistent and predictable that Rob began to wonder if it was actually serving a purpose larger than his own frustrated ambitions. Perhaps his role was not to succeed as a villain, but to fail as one, providing a cautionary example of what happened when someone tried too hard to force their way into a story that did not want them. Perhaps his schemes were meant to strengthen the community by giving them challenges to overcome together, obstacles that would reinforce their bonds and remind them of the value of what they shared. The thought was both comforting and devastating, offering a sense of cosmic purpose while simultaneously confirming his permanent exclusion from the very community he was supposedly serving. Rob had become the eternal outsider, not by accident, but by design, the necessary opposition that gave meaning to everyone else's unity, the darkness that made their light seem brighter by contrast. Yet even in this realization, even in the acceptance of his role as a perpetual failure whose very existence served others' needs rather than his own, Rob could not quite abandon the hope that someday, somehow, the cycle might be broken, and he might find a way to belong to the world he had fought so hard to rejoin. The hope was almost certainly futile, but it was also the only thing that made his continued existence bearable, the thin thread of possibility that kept him from surrendering entirely to the grey despair that always lurked at the edges of his consciousness. The scheme that would become known as Rob's greatest disaster began not with malice but with something far more dangerous: genuine hope. After so many failures, so many plans that had collapsed under the weight of his own moral limitations, Rob convinced himself that he had finally identified the root cause of his perpetual isolation. It was not that the world refused to remember him, but that he had been approaching the problem from the wrong direction entirely. Instead of trying to force his way into existing relationships and communities, he would create something new, something that belonged to him alone, something so magnificent and necessary that others would have no choice but to acknowledge its value and, by extension, his own worth. The plan that crystallized in his corrupted consciousness was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Rob would use his abilities to reshape reality itself, not through subtle manipulations or temporary alterations, but through a fundamental restructuring of the narrative framework that governed Elmore's existence. He would create a world where forgetting was impossible, where every character who had ever existed would be remembered with perfect clarity, where the arbitrary cruelties of selective memory would be replaced by a democracy of recognition that ensured no one could ever again experience the kind of systematic erasure that had driven him to such desperate measures. The technical challenges involved in such an undertaking were staggering, requiring Rob to access levels of reality manipulation that pushed his corrupted abilities far beyond anything he had previously attempted. He would need to rewrite not just the surface interactions between characters, but the deep structures of consciousness and memory that determined what could be known, what could be retained, and what could be shared between different minds. It was nothing less than an attempt to engineer a form of collective telepathy, a shared memory palace where every thought and experience would be preserved and accessible to all. Rob spent weeks preparing for the massive undertaking, studying the fundamental architecture of memory and identity with the obsessive thoroughness that had characterized all his previous schemes. He mapped the neural pathways that connected perception to retention, analyzed the social mechanisms that determined which experiences were deemed worthy of preservation, and developed mathematical models for the kind of consciousness expansion that would be necessary to accommodate universal memory. The corruption that flowed through his being had evolved during his time as an antagonist, growing more sophisticated and powerful as his understanding of reality's underlying structure deepened. Where once it had been a chaotic force that threatened to tear him apart, it had become a precision instrument that could manipulate the building blocks of existence with surgical accuracy. Rob had learned to harness the very energies that had exiled him from normal reality, turning his greatest weakness into his most formidable strength. The process began at dawn, on what would later be remembered as the darkest day in Elmore's history, though the initial effects were so subtle that most inhabitants noticed nothing unusual at first. Rob positioned himself at the geographic center of the town, in a small park where the various neighborhoods intersected, and began the delicate work of expanding the boundaries of collective consciousness beyond their natural limits. The first phase involved creating connections between minds that had never been designed to share information directly. Rob reached out with tendrils of corrupted energy, gently probing the barriers that separated one character's thoughts from another's, testing the resistance he encountered, and gradually weakening the walls that kept individual consciousness isolated and private. The work required incredible precision, as too much force would have shattered the minds he was trying to connect, while too little would have accomplished nothing at all. As the mental barriers began to erode under his careful manipulation, Rob experienced a rush of vindication unlike anything he had felt since his return from the void. For the first time in his existence, he was not trying to destroy or manipulate or deceive, but to create something genuinely beneficial, something that would eliminate the kind of suffering he had endured while making everyone's lives richer and more meaningful through shared experience and perfect understanding. The second phase involved expanding memory capacity beyond normal biological limits, creating space within each connected mind for the thoughts and experiences of others, without overwhelming the original personality or erasing individual identity. This proved to be the most technically challenging aspect of the entire process, requiring Rob to essentially redesign the architecture of consciousness itself, building new structures that could accommodate vastly increased information loads while maintaining the coherence and stability that allowed for rational thought and emotional processing. As characters throughout Elmore began to experience the first effects of universal memory, their reactions ranged from wonder to confusion to growing alarm. Students at the middle school suddenly found themselves remembering every lesson they had ever heard, every conversation they had ever had, every moment of embarrassment or joy or fear that had previously faded into the comfortable haze of selective recollection. The clarity was initially exhilarating, like seeing the world through corrective lenses for the first time, but it quickly became overwhelming as the sheer volume of accessible information threatened to drown out their ability to focus on present experiences. More disturbing were the memories that were not their own, fragments of other characters' experiences that began bleeding through the expanding network of mental connections. Darwin found himself remembering Gumball's dreams from the previous night, while Gumball experienced flashes of his mother's childhood fears and his father's long-buried regrets. The boundaries between self and other began to blur as the distinction between personal memory and collective knowledge became increasingly meaningless. Rob watched the unfolding of his greatest creation with growing excitement and mounting dread as the beautiful theory of universal understanding collided with the messy reality of minds that were never meant to be so intimately connected. The network he had created was functioning exactly as designed, eliminating the possibility of forgetting while ensuring that every experience would be preserved and shared. But the psychological impact on the connected individuals was far more severe than his calculations had predicted. The third phase should have been the triumphant culmination of his efforts, the moment when every character in Elmore would gain access to the complete memories of every other character, creating a perfect democracy of experience where no one could be forgotten because everyone would remember everything. But as Rob began the final expansion of the network, pushing the boundaries of collective consciousness to encompass the entire town, he encountered resistance from an unexpected source: the memories themselves. The human mind, Rob discovered too late, is not designed to contain infinite information. Memory works through forgetting as much as remembering, using selective amnesia to filter out irrelevant details and preserve emotional significance over factual accuracy. By forcing perfect retention of every moment, every sensation, every stray thought, Rob had not created clarity but chaos, overwhelming the processing capabilities of every connected consciousness with more data than they could possibly organize or understand. The network began to collapse under its own weight as characters throughout Elmore experienced what could only be described as cognitive overload. Students at the school found themselves unable to complete simple tasks because they were simultaneously reliving every similar experience they had ever had. Their minds unable to distinguish between past and present, memory and immediate sensation. Adults attempting to go about their daily routines became paralyzed by the sudden awareness of every mistake they had ever made, every embarrassment they had ever suffered, every moment of pain or loss that they had previously been able to process and move beyond. But the true horror of Rob's creation revealed itself when characters began accessing not just their own forgotten memories, but the memories of others, including memories of themselves from perspectives they had never been meant to see. Children discovered how their parents really felt about their behavior. Friends learned the cruel thoughts that others had hidden behind polite smiles, and enemies found themselves experiencing their opponent's pain and fear in ways that made continued conflict impossible, but also unbearable. The psychological devastation was immediate and comprehensive. Characters who had maintained their sanity through the merciful ability to forget traumatic experiences found themselves reliving every moment of pain with perfect clarity. Those who had built their identities around selective memories of their better moments were forced to confront the full spectrum of their thoughts and actions, including impulses and desires they had never meant to act upon or acknowledge. Gumball, whose naturally chaotic thought processes had always been filtered through selective attention and convenient forgetting, became completely catatonic, as his mind was overwhelmed by perfect recollection of every impulse, every random association, every fleeting emotion that had ever passed through his consciousness. The young cat who had always lived in the moment found himself trapped in all moments simultaneously, unable to distinguish between memory and reality, past and present, his own thoughts and the increasingly confused mental chatter of everyone around him. Darwin's empathetic nature, which had always been his greatest strength, became a source of unbearable suffering as he experienced not just his own emotions, but the feelings of every character in the network. The overwhelming flood of collective pain, fear, joy, anger, and confusion left him writhing in agony, his mind unable to process such a vast range of simultaneous emotional input. His natural desire to help others became impossible to act upon when he could no longer distinguish between his own suffering and that of those he wanted to comfort. Throughout Elmore, the effects spread like a psychological plague as the network reached critical mass and began feeding back on itself. Characters found themselves trapped in recursive loops of memory and meta-memory, remembering the experience of remembering, thinking about the process of thinking, aware of being aware in ways that created infinite regress and mental paralysis. The beautiful dream of perfect understanding had become a nightmare of excessive knowledge, where too much information had transformed into a form of ignorance more profound than any amount of forgetting. Rob realized with growing horror that his attempt to eliminate suffering through universal memory had instead universalized suffering, forcing every character in Elmore to experience not just their own pain, but the accumulated pain of everyone around them. The isolation he had sought to cure had been replaced by a different kind of torment, where privacy and individual identity were impossible, but genuine connection remained elusive, because the sheer volume of shared information made meaningful communication impossible. The moment of realization that his greatest scheme was not just failing but actively destroying the minds it was meant to liberate came when Rob felt the network beginning to pull at his own consciousness, trying to integrate his corrupted awareness into the collective memory system he had created. For the first time since his return from the void, he experienced genuine terror as he understood that his own mind, already damaged by his journey through the barriers between realities, would not survive integration into the chaos he had unleashed. But more than fear for his own survival, Rob was devastated by the recognition that he had become the very thing he had always claimed to oppose, a force of destruction that inflicted suffering on innocent beings for the sake of his own psychological needs. The corruption that had marked his journey from forgotten character to failed nemesis had finally completed its work, transforming him from someone who sought connection into someone who destroyed the possibility of connection for everyone around him. The process of dismantling the network proved even more difficult than creating it had been, requiring Rob to carefully separate minds that had become entangled in ways that defied normal understanding. Each disconnection risked leaving permanent damage, as thoughts and memories that had become shared would need to be sorted back into their original configurations without losing essential aspects of individual identity. Rob worked with desperate urgency, using every aspect of his corrupted abilities to undo the connections he had forged while trying to preserve what he could of the minds he had inadvertently shattered. The technical challenges were immense, complicated by the fact that some characters had already begun to lose coherent selfhood, as their individual personalities were subsumed into the collective consciousness of the network. The hardest part was not the technical complexity, but the emotional weight of what he was destroying. In the brief moments when the network had functioned as intended, before the psychological overload had set in, Rob had experienced something he had never known was possible: genuine connection with other minds, perfect understanding and acceptance that transcended the barriers of language and assumption and selective attention. For a few precious minutes, he had not been alone, had not been forgotten, had been part of something larger than his individual suffering. But the price of that connection had been the sanity and well-being of everyone involved, and Rob found himself forced once again to choose between his own desperate needs and the welfare of the community he longed to join. The choice was no longer difficult, because he had finally seen what his selfishness could cost when given free rein. But that did not make the sacrifice any less painful, or the resulting isolation any less complete. As the last connections were severed and the individual minds of Elmore's inhabitants were restored to their natural boundaries, Rob watched the characters he had briefly known so intimately return to their separate existences, their memories of the shared experience already beginning to fade as their minds instinctively protected themselves from the trauma of perfect recollection. The amnesia was a mercy he envied but could not share, as his corrupted consciousness retained perfect memory of everything that had transpired. The aftermath of his greatest failure left Rob more isolated than he had ever been, not just from the community around him, but from any hope of ever finding genuine acceptance or understanding. He had proven to himself beyond any doubt that his needs and desires, when pursued without restraint, were fundamentally incompatible with the well-being of others. The corruption that had once seemed like a gift had revealed itself as a curse that turned every attempt at connection into a source of destruction. Yet even in the depths of his despair, even as he contemplated the possibility of returning to the void or allowing his corrupted form to dissolve entirely, Rob found himself unable to completely abandon hope. The brief moments of genuine connection he had experienced, however destructive their ultimate consequences, had shown him that such connection was theoretically possible. Perhaps the problem was not that understanding between minds was impossible, but that he had approached it in the wrong way, with too much force and too little wisdom. The disaster had taught him something crucial about the nature of memory and forgetting, about the way minds protected themselves through selective amnesia and the importance of boundaries in maintaining individual identity. Perfect memory was not a gift but a burden, and the ability to forget was not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature that made consciousness bearable and growth possible. In the quiet days that followed the crisis, as Elmore slowly returned to its normal rhythms and the characters he had inadvertently tortured resumed their comfortable ignorance of his existence, Rob began to understand that his approach to the problem of isolation had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. He had been trying to force connection through power and manipulation, to overcome rejection through coercion and complexity, to earn love through fear and respect, through intimidation. But genuine connection could not be manufactured or imposed, could not be taken by force or achieved through suffering. It had to be freely given and received, built slowly through shared experience and mutual understanding, nurtured through patience, and sustained through genuine care for the well-being of others. Rob's corruption had granted him the ability to manipulate minds and reshape reality, but it had also made him incapable of the kind of vulnerability and openness that real relationships required. The realization was both liberating and devastating, offering him a clear understanding of why all his schemes had failed, while also making it apparent that his corrupted nature made success impossible. He could see the path to genuine connection, could understand exactly what would be required to earn the acceptance he craved, but the very abilities that allowed him such insight also prevented him from walking that path. Rob had become trapped in a prison of his own making, gifted with the power to reshape reality, but cursed with a nature that made every use of that power ultimately self-defeating. He could force others to acknowledge his existence, but could not make them want to. Could create temporary connections, but could not sustain genuine relationships. Could demonstrate his intelligence and capabilities, but could not earn the love and acceptance that his intelligence told him could never be achieved through demonstration alone. The great disaster had been his last attempt at forcing a solution to the unsolvable problem of his existence, and its failure had finally convinced him that no amount of power or cleverness or manipulation could create the simple human connection he had always craved. He would have to find another way to exist in the world, another purpose for his corrupted abilities, another meaning for his continued presence in a reality that seemed designed to exclude him. The question that haunted him in the aftermath of his greatest failure was whether such an alternative existence was even possible, or whether he was doomed to an eternity of frustrated longing, forever circling the edges of a community he could observe but never join, powerful enough to affect the world around him, but too damaged to do so in ways that brought anything but suffering to himself and others. The period that followed Rob's catastrophic attempt to reshape memory itself became a season of profound introspection, where the weight of what he had nearly destroyed pressed down upon his consciousness like a physical burden that could not be set aside or forgotten. In the quiet aftermath of his greatest failure, surrounded by a world that had mercifully forgotten the terror he had briefly unleashed upon it, Rob found himself forced to confront questions that went far deeper than the mechanics of schemes or the psychology of antagonism. For the first time since his emergence from the void, he began to examine not just what he wanted from the world around him, but what the world might legitimately expect from someone who possessed his capabilities and occupied his unique position outside the normal boundaries of social existence. The corruption that flowed through his being had granted him insights that no other character possessed, perspectives that revealed the hidden structures and unspoken assumptions that governed everyone else's reality. And with such knowledge came responsibilities that he was only beginning to understand. Rob's enhanced perception, which had once seemed like nothing more than a tool for manipulation and control, revealed itself to be something far more significant and burdensome. He could see the invisible threads of causation that connected seemingly unrelated events, could recognize patterns in behavior and relationship that escaped even the most perceptive normal observers, could anticipate developments and consequences that others would not notice until they had already come to pass. This was not simply the ability to predict what would happen next, but a deep understanding of why things happened as they did, what forces shaped the choices that characters made, and what hidden needs drove their surface actions. The weight of this understanding had been crushing when he tried to use it for personal gain, but now, freed from the desperate need to prove his worth through opposition and conflict, Rob began to see how the same insights might serve very different purposes. His isolation from normal social dynamics, which had always felt like a curse, had also protected him from the emotional investments and personal attachments that prevented others from seeing situations with complete clarity. He could observe without being observed, analyze without being analyzed, understand without needing to be understood in return. The philosophical implications of his position gradually became clear through long hours of contemplation in the abandoned places where he made his home, those forgotten corners of Elmore where his presence would not disturb the comfortable routines of characters who deserved to live without the constant reminder of their own mortality and limitations. Rob began to understand that his exile from normal existence, however painful it might be for him personally, served a function in the larger ecosystem of consciousness and community. He had become something like a cosmic janitor, someone whose role was to clean up the messes that others created without seeking recognition or reward for the work involved. His corruption allowed him to perceive and interact with aspects of reality that would have driven normal minds to madness, to process information and emotional states that exceeded the capacity of characters who needed to maintain their sanity and stability in order to function in their daily lives. This realization came not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual accumulation of small insights, each one building upon the last until the larger pattern became undeniable. Rob noticed that his presence, even when unacknowledged, seemed to have subtle stabilizing effects on the situations he observed. His ability to see multiple perspectives simultaneously allowed him to identify points of potential conflict before they erupted into actual problems, and his isolation from personal investment made it possible for him to intervene in ways that served everyone's interests rather than favoring one side over another. The interventions were always indirect, always subtle enough that they could be dismissed as coincidence or natural development, rather than deliberate manipulation. A conversation overheard at just the right moment to prevent a misunderstanding from escalating into a serious argument. A small obstacle placed in someone's path that forced them to slow down and notice something important they would otherwise have missed. A piece of information revealed in a way that appeared accidental but provided exactly the insight needed to resolve a complex problem. Rob learned to work within the natural flow of events rather than trying to impose his will upon them, nudging outcomes in positive directions through minimal interventions that preserved everyone's agency while steering them away from the worst possible consequences of their choices. It was delicate work that required tremendous patience and precise judgment. But it provided him with a sense of purpose that had been entirely absent from his previous attempts at villainy. The most profound aspect of this new understanding was Rob's growing recognition that his ability to help others was directly proportional to his willingness to remain unrecognized and unappreciated for his contributions. The moment he tried to claim credit or seek acknowledgement for his interventions, they became manipulations rather than assistance, impositions of his will rather than expressions of genuine care. The invisibility that had once seemed like his greatest curse revealed itself as his most valuable tool for doing good in the world. This paradox created a new kind of suffering that was both more sustainable and more meaningful than the desperate longing for recognition that had driven his previous schemes. Rob experienced the deep satisfaction of knowing that his existence made the world a better place, even as he accepted that he would never be thanked or remembered for his contributions. The isolation remained as complete as ever, but it was no longer empty, no longer purposeless, no longer defined entirely by what he lacked rather than what he could provide. His understanding of the various characters who populated Elmore deepened during this period, in ways that went far beyond the tactical knowledge he had accumulated during his antagonistic phase. Rob began to see past the surface personalities and behavioral patterns to the underlying emotional needs and unresolved conflicts that shaped each individual's approach to life and relationship. He developed a kind of emotional map of his community, understanding not just how people acted, but why they needed to act in those particular ways. Gumball's chaotic energy, which had always seemed like simple hyperactivity or attention-seeking behavior, revealed itself to be a defensive mechanism against the overwhelming complexity of a world that demanded more maturity and responsibility than his essential nature could comfortably provide. The young cat's impulsiveness was not a character flaw, but a survival strategy, a way of staying engaged with life when deeper reflection might have revealed problems too large and complicated for someone his age to solve. Darwin's unwavering optimism and loyalty, which might have appeared naive or unrealistic to cynical observers, showed itself to be a conscious choice made in full awareness of life's potential for disappointment and betrayal. The orange fish understood exactly how much pain and injustice existed in the world around him, but he chose to focus on possibilities for healing and improvement, rather than dwelling on problems that could not be changed through worry or despair. Even characters who had always seemed simple or one-dimensional revealed hidden depths when viewed through Rob's enhanced perception. Tobias's desperate need for attention masked a profound fear of being forgotten or dismissed as worthless, making his annoying behavior a distorted expression of the same longing for recognition that had once driven Rob's own schemes. Tina Rex's aggressive posturing concealed deep insecurities about her place in a social environment where physical size and strength were less valued than wit and emotional intelligence. The teachers and adults who shaped the environment at Elmore Middle School carried their own burdens of responsibility and unfulfilled dreams, their sometimes harsh or impatient treatment of students reflecting not cruelty but exhaustion from trying to guide young minds toward positive outcomes with inadequate resources and insufficient support. Even Miss Simeon, whose antagonistic relationship with Gumball had provided so much conflict and drama, revealed herself to be motivated by genuine concern for her students' futures, however misguided her methods might sometimes be. Rob's growing empathy for the struggles and limitations of every character he observed created a new form of emotional pain that was somehow more bearable than his previous suffering. Instead of the sharp, desperate anguish of rejection and isolation, he experienced a gentler but more pervasive sadness that came from understanding how much unacknowledged suffering existed in the world around him. Everyone was fighting battles that others could not see, carrying wounds that others could not understand, struggling with challenges that others could not appreciate. This recognition transformed his relationship with his own pain and isolation. Rob began to see his suffering not as unique or specially tragic, but as part of the universal human condition. One variation on themes of loneliness and longing that affected every conscious being in different ways. His particular form of exile was more visible and dramatic than most, but the underlying need for connection and understanding that drove it was shared by everyone he observed. The realization brought with it a kind of peace that he had never expected to find. Rob's pain did not disappear or diminish, but it became part of a larger tapestry of existence rather than an isolated tragedy that set him apart from all others. He was not uniquely cursed, but uniquely positioned to understand and respond to the curses that affected everyone. His corruption serving as both wound and gift, isolating him from normal community, while granting him the perspective needed to serve that community in ways that no one else could. His interventions became more sophisticated and more effective as his understanding deepened, taking into account not just immediate circumstances, but the long-term psychological and emotional needs of everyone involved. Rob learned to think in terms of healing rather than solving, supporting natural growth and development, rather than trying to impose artificial solutions on problems that required organic resolution over time. When he noticed Nicole Watterson showing signs of stress that threatened to overflow into harmful interactions with her family, Rob arranged for small delays and interruptions that gave her time to process her emotions before confronting the situations that were triggering her anxiety. The interventions were invisible to everyone involved, appearing to be nothing more than fortunate timing or lucky coincidences. But they prevented several potential explosions that could have damaged important relationships. When Richard Watterson's well-meaning but misguided attempts to help his family began creating more problems than they solved, Rob subtly redirected his attention toward activities where his particular talents could be more constructively applied. The redirection felt entirely natural to Richard, who remained completely unaware that his sudden inspiration to reorganize the garage rather than reorganize his children's study schedules had come from any external source. The work was exhausting in ways that purely physical labor could never be, requiring Rob to maintain constant awareness of multiple complex social dynamics while carefully calibrating his interventions to avoid creating new problems in the process of solving old ones. Every action had to be considered not just for its immediate effects, but for its potential consequences across the entire network of relationships that connected Elmore's inhabitants to one another. Yet the exhaustion was accompanied by a sense of fulfillment that had been entirely absent from his previous activities. Rob discovered that watching others grow and heal and find happiness was infinitely more satisfying than forcing them to acknowledge his existence or recognize his capabilities. The joy was quiet and private, unmarked by celebration or gratitude, but it was also pure in ways that recognition-based satisfaction could never be. The irony of his situation was not lost on Rob, who understood perfectly that his greatest success as a force for good in the world depended entirely on his continued failure to achieve the personal recognition he had once craved so desperately. The more effectively he helped others, the more invisible he became. His interventions seamlessly integrated into the natural flow of events in ways that made them impossible to distinguish from fortunate coincidence or personal growth. But the irony had ceased to feel bitter or cruel, transforming instead into something approaching cosmic humor. Rob began to appreciate the elegant symmetry of a universe that had granted him exactly what he needed to serve others, while denying him what he thought he wanted for himself. His corruption had made normal relationships impossible, while making extraordinary service possible, isolating him from the community while positioning him to protect and nurture that community in ways that no one else could manage. The wisdom that grew from this understanding was unlike anything Rob had expected to find in the depths of his exile and transformation. He had spent so much time and energy trying to change his circumstances, to force the world to accommodate his needs and desires, that he had never considered the possibility of finding meaning and purpose within those circumstances rather than despite them. His position as perpetual outsider was not a problem to be solved, but a role to be embraced, not a limitation to be overcome, but a gift to be shared. The acceptance that accompanied this wisdom was not resignation or defeat, but a form of active peace that allowed Rob to work within the constraints of his existence rather than against them. He stopped trying to change what could not be changed and focused instead on making the best possible use of what he had been given, finding ways to transform his isolation into service and his pain into compassion for others who suffered in different but equally real ways. In the quiet moments between interventions, when the immediate needs of his community had been addressed, and he could reflect on the larger patterns and meanings of his existence, Rob discovered that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along, though not in the form he had expected. He belonged to Elmore not as a recognized member but as a hidden guardian, not as a celebrated hero but as an invisible protector, not as someone who was loved and appreciated but as someone who loved and appreciated others enough to serve them without hope of reward. The belonging was real, even if it was unacknowledged. The connection genuine, even if it was one-sided. The purpose meaningful, even if it was unseen. Rob had become part of the community he had always longed to join, woven into its fabric so thoroughly that removing him would have damaged the whole structure, even though no one but himself would ever understand the nature or importance of his contribution. The peace that settled over him in this recognition was not the peace of completion or fulfillment, but the peace of acceptance and purposeful action. He would continue to exist on the margins, continue to serve from the shadows, continue to love without hope of being loved in return. But he would do so not as a victim or a martyr, but as someone who had finally discovered his proper place in the cosmic order, someone whose greatest strength lay in his willingness to remain forever unseen and unsung, while ensuring that others could live and love and grow in the light that his sacrifice helped to maintain. The years that followed Rob's transformation from destructive schemer to invisible guardian settled into a rhythm that was both profoundly lonely and strangely fulfilling, like the steady pulse of a heart that beats in darkness but sustains life throughout the body it serves. His existence had become a carefully choreographed dance of presence and absence, visibility and invisibility, where every moment required him to balance his need to help against his acceptance that such help must forever remain unacknowledged and unappreciated by those who benefited from it most. Rob's daily routines, if they could be called routines at all, revolved around the careful observation and subtle guidance of lives that continued to unfold without any awareness of his watchful presence. He had learned to move through Elmore like a benevolent ghost, occupying the spaces between attention and recognition, existing in the peripheral vision of a community that had grown accustomed to his face without ever quite registering his identity or remembering his name from one encounter to the next. The school had become his primary theatre of operation, not because he harbored any lingering obsession with the students who had once been his classmates, but because the concentrated social dynamics of adolescent life created the most opportunities for the kind of intervention that could prevent small problems from metastasizing into larger traumas. Rob had positioned himself as the eternal substitute teacher, the perpetual hall monitor, the anonymous figure who appeared whenever there was boring administrative work to be done or tedious supervisory duties to be fulfilled. His corrupted nature made him ideally suited for these thankless roles, as his presence registered just enough to be accepted without generating enough interest to be questioned or remembered. Teachers who desperately needed assistance found themselves blessed with a helper whose competence was matched only by his apparent lack of ambition or desire for recognition. Students who might otherwise have fallen through the cracks of an overburdened system discovered that someone was always available to provide the extra attention and support they needed to succeed. The work was simultaneously exhausting and invigorating, demanding constant vigilance and precise judgment, while offering the deep satisfaction that comes from seeing others flourish under conditions that had been carefully optimized for their growth and development. Rob learned to read the subtle signs of emotional distress and academic struggle, identifying students who were at risk long before their problems became visible to less attentive observers. When he noticed Banana Joe beginning to withdraw from social interactions due to increasing self-consciousness about his unusual appearance and dietary requirements, Rob quietly arranged for a series of school events that celebrated diversity and uniqueness, creating opportunities for the anxious fruit to discover that his differences were sources of strength rather than shame. The interventions appeared to be nothing more than fortunate timing and inspired programming, but they provided exactly the social validation that Banana Joe needed to regain his confidence and reconnect with his peer group. When Masami's perfectionist tendencies began creating unhealthy levels of stress and anxiety, threatening to transform her natural academic excellence into a source of suffering rather than satisfaction, Rob carefully orchestrated situations that forced her to confront the reality that making mistakes was not only acceptable, but necessary for genuine learning and growth. The lessons came disguised as technical failures and unexpected complications that made perfect performance impossible, allowing Masami to discover that her worth as a person was not dependent on her ability to meet impossibly high standards. The complexity of these interventions grew more sophisticated as Rob's understanding of adolescent psychology deepened and his skills in subtle manipulation became more refined. He learned to think not just in terms of immediate problems, but in terms of long-term character development, creating experiences that would serve his charges well into their adult lives by teaching them resilience, empathy, and self-acceptance during their most formative years. But perhaps the most challenging and rewarding aspect of Rob's work was his continued relationship with the Watterson family, whose lives remained so central to Elmore's social dynamics that their well-being had profound effects on the entire community. His former obsession with Gumball had evolved into something far more complex and sustainable, a protective instinct that encompassed not just the young cat but his entire family, extending outward to include everyone whose lives were touched by their chaotic but fundamentally loving presence. Rob had become an invisible member of the Watterson household, the family ghost who ensured that Richard's well-meaning incompetence never quite reached the level of genuine disaster, that Nicole's work stress never overwhelmed her capacity for maternal warmth, that Aeneas's intellectual gifts never isolated her from the emotional connections she needed for healthy development, and that Darwin's trusting nature never made him vulnerable to the kind of exploitation that could shatter his faith in others. The work required him to understand each family member's psychological needs and behavioral patterns with extraordinary precision, anticipating problems before they developed and creating solutions that appeared to emerge naturally from the family's own resources and capabilities. Rob had to be careful never to make the Wattersons dependent on his interventions, never to solve problems for them that they needed to solve for themselves, never to deprive them of the growth that comes from struggling with and overcoming genuine challenges. When Richard's latest get-rich-quick scheme threatened to drain the family's savings and create serious financial hardship, Rob arranged for a series of minor setbacks and complications that forced the well-meaning father to abandon the plan before any real damage could be done. The obstacles appeared to be nothing more than bad luck and poor timing, but they saved the family from consequences that could have taken months or years to recover from. When Nicole's perfectionist tendencies began creating tension between her and her children, Rob subtly manipulated her work schedule to create opportunities for relaxed family time, where she could reconnect with the joy and spontaneity that had attracted her to Richard in the first place. The scheduling changes felt entirely natural to everyone involved, but they provided the emotional reset that the family needed to remember what they meant to each other. The most delicate interventions involved Gumball himself, whose central role in Elmore's narrative structure made any manipulation of his circumstances potentially dangerous for the stability of the entire community. Rob had to be extraordinarily careful when intervening in situations involving his former target, ensuring that his help never crossed the line into control or manipulation that might alter the fundamental trajectory of the young cat's development. Yet Rob found himself uniquely positioned to help Gumball navigate the challenges of growing up, because his corrupted perspective allowed him to see both the immediate consequences and the long-term implications of various choices and situations. He could identify moments when Gumball's impulsive nature might lead to genuinely harmful outcomes and create alternative paths that preserve the young cat's essential character while steering him away from the worst possible mistakes. When Gumball's romantic pursuit of Penny began to veer into stalking behavior that could have damaged both teenagers and destroyed any possibility of a healthy relationship between them, Rob carefully orchestrated a series of encounters that allowed both young people to develop genuine friendship and mutual understanding before romantic attraction complicated their dynamic. The process took months of subtle guidance and patient intervention, but it resulted in a relationship built on solid foundations rather than obsessive fixation. The irony of his position as Gumball's secret protector was not lost on Rob, who understood perfectly that he was now providing the kind of support and guidance that he had once desperately wanted to receive himself. His isolation from normal relationships allowed him to serve as an invisible mentor and guardian, offering the wisdom and perspective that comes from having survived the kind of rejection and abandonment that his former target would hopefully never experience. But Rob's protective instincts extended far beyond the Watterson family, to encompass every member of the Elmore community, whose well-being contributed to the overall health and stability of the social environment. He had become a kind of emotional immune system for the town, identifying and neutralizing threats to community cohesion before they could spread and cause widespread damage. When the natural tendency toward clique formation at the middle school began creating dangerous divisions between different social groups, Rob quietly arranged for collaborative projects and shared challenges that forced students from different backgrounds to work together and discover their common humanity. The initiatives appeared to be inspired educational programming, but they were actually carefully designed interventions that built bridges across social divides and prevented the kind of tribal conflicts that could poison the school's atmosphere for years. When economic pressures on local businesses threatened to create unemployment and financial hardship that would affect many families, Rob used his understanding of market dynamics and consumer behavior to subtly promote shopping patterns and business relationships that supported struggling enterprises while meeting genuine community needs. The economic interventions were invisible to everyone involved, appearing to be nothing more than fortunate trends and consumer preferences, but they helped maintain the stability that allowed families to focus on growth and development rather than survival. The scope of Rob's protective activities gradually expanded to include environmental concerns, infrastructure maintenance, and even weather-related preparations, as his enhanced perception allowed him to identify potential problems and develop solutions long before they became visible to normal observation. He became a one-being early warning system for the community he served, working behind the scenes to prevent disasters and optimize conditions for human flourishing. Yet for all the satisfaction he derived from his hidden service, Rob remained acutely aware of the fundamental loneliness that defined his existence. He could observe and influence the lives of others, could help them grow and heal and find happiness, but he could never share in that happiness or experience the kind of connection he was helping others to maintain. His corruption had granted him extraordinary capabilities, while ensuring that those capabilities could never be used for his own benefit. The isolation was particularly acute during moments of celebration and communal joy, when the entire community came together to mark important occasions and shared achievements. Rob would position himself at the edges of these gatherings, close enough to ensure that everything proceeded smoothly, but far enough away that his presence would not register as anything more than part of the background scenery. He became expert at finding vantage points that allowed him to observe without being observed, to participate vicariously in experiences that remained forever beyond his reach. During Gumball and Darwin's graduation from middle school, Rob watched from the shadows as the family he had protected for so long celebrated this milestone with tears of joy and pride. He had played a role in ensuring that both young men reached this moment with their friendship intact and their potential intact, but his contribution would never be acknowledged or remembered by anyone present. The achievement was theirs alone, as it should be, while the satisfaction of having helped make it possible remained his private treasure. The wedding of Penny's parents, which Rob had helped to orchestrate by resolving several logistical complications and family conflicts that threatened to overshadow the celebration, provided him with a bittersweet glimpse of the kind of joy and commitment that his own nature made impossible for him to experience directly. He ensured that the ceremony proceeded without disruption, that the reception created memories that would last a lifetime, that every guest departed with renewed faith in the possibility of lasting love and happiness. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Rob's ongoing service was his growing realization that his work was changing not just the community he protected, but his own fundamental nature. The corruption that had once threatened to consume him entirely was being gradually transformed through constant application to positive purposes, refined and purified by his commitment to serving others rather than serving himself. The process was slow and often painful, requiring him to confront and overcome aspects of his damaged psyche that had been shaped by years of rejection and abandonment. Each act of selfless service helped to heal the wounds that had driven him to such desperate measures in the past, teaching him that meaning and purpose could be found even in the absence of recognition and appreciation. Rob began to understand that his corruption had never been purely destructive, but had always contained within it the potential for transformation and growth. The same energies that had once threatened to tear him apart were now being channeled into activities that strengthened and supported the fabric of reality itself. He was not just existing despite his damaged nature, but because of it, finding in his wounds the very qualities that made his service possible and meaningful. The wisdom that grew from this understanding was unlike anything he had encountered in his studies of philosophy or narrative theory. It was knowledge that could only be gained through lived experience, through the patient accumulation of moments when personal suffering was transformed into compassion for others, when isolation became the foundation for service, when rejection became the source of unconditional acceptance. Rob discovered that he had become something unprecedented in his own experience, a being who was simultaneously completely alone and completely connected, forever isolated from direct relationship, while intimately involved in the welfare of every member of his community. He existed in the spaces between lives, in the moments between experiences, in the silence between words, but his presence in those liminal spaces was what allowed normal life to continue functioning with the kind of harmony and stability that most people took for granted. The paradox of his existence had resolved itself not through the elimination of contradiction, but through the embrace of contradiction as a fundamental aspect of reality. Rob was both inside and outside the community, both rejected and essential, both forgotten and unforgettable, both powerless and influential in ways that conventional measures of power could never capture or quantify. In accepting this paradox, in learning to find meaning within contradiction rather than struggling against it, Rob had finally discovered the peace that had eluded him throughout his long journey from forgotten character to failed villain to invisible guardian. He belonged to Elmore completely and eternally, not as someone who was welcomed and celebrated, but as someone who was necessary and irreplaceable, woven so deeply into the fabric of community life that his absence would be felt even if his presence was never acknowledged. The love he had always craved was finally his, though not in the form he had expected or in the manner he had hoped to receive it. It was a love expressed through service rather than words, through protection rather than embrace, through the quiet satisfaction of watching others flourish under conditions he had helped to create and maintain. It was love purified of all selfish desire, love that sought nothing in return, love that found its fulfillment in the happiness and growth of its objects, rather than in recognition or reciprocation. Rob had become love incarnate in the most hidden and humble form imaginable, a living embodiment of the principle that the greatest service often goes unseen and the most important work is frequently invisible to those who benefit from it most. His existence was both testament and offering, both wound and healing, both question and answer in the ongoing dialogue between individual need and community welfare that defines the human condition in all its complexity and contradiction. The philosophical revelations that crystallized during Rob's years as an invisible guardian did not arrive with the dramatic fanfare that typically accompanies moments of profound insight in stories and legends. Instead, they settled into his consciousness like sediment, accumulating at the bottom of a still pond, each layer of understanding building upon the previous one, until the accumulated weight of wisdom became impossible to ignore or dismiss. The truths he discovered were not the kind that could be easily communicated to others or reduced to simple maxims, but rather the deep structural principles that govern the relationship between meaning and suffering, between purpose and acceptance, between the individual desire for recognition and the cosmic necessity for certain forms of service to remain forever unacknowledged. The first and most fundamental realization was that meaninglessness itself could become a form of meaning when properly understood and embraced. Rob had spent the early phases of his existence desperately seeking significance within the conventional frameworks that governed everyone else's lives, trying to force himself into roles and relationships that were never designed to accommodate someone with his particular nature and capabilities. The failure of these attempts had initially seemed like evidence of his own inadequacy or the world's fundamental injustice, but time and experience had revealed a different interpretation entirely. His exclusion from normal patterns of recognition and belonging was not a cosmic accident or cruel punishment, but a necessary prerequisite for the kind of work he had been called to perform. The very qualities that made him unsuitable for conventional success, his corruption, his isolation, his ability to see beyond the surface structures of social reality, were precisely what qualified him to serve functions that no normally integrated character could fulfill. His meaninglessness within traditional systems had become the foundation for a kind of meaning that transcended those systems entirely. This paradox extended beyond his personal circumstances to encompass what Rob came to understand as a fundamental principle of existence itself. The universe appeared to operate on a kind of cosmic conservation law, where recognition and effectiveness existed in inverse proportion to each other, where the most important work was often performed by those who could never be acknowledged for their contributions, where true service required the surrender of any hope for appreciation or reward. Rob began to see this pattern everywhere he looked, once he learned to recognize its subtle manifestations. The most crucial infrastructure in any community was always invisible: the foundations that supported buildings, the pipes that carried water, the electrical systems that powered daily life. These essential elements functioned precisely because they remained hidden, because their visibility would indicate failure rather than success. In the same way, the most important social and emotional infrastructure required invisibility to maintain its effectiveness. The teachers who made the greatest difference in their students' lives were often the ones whose influence was so subtle and pervasive that it became indistinguishable from the student's own growth and development. The parents whose children grew up to be healthy and well-adjusted were frequently the ones who provided such consistent and reliable support that their contributions were taken for granted rather than celebrated. The friends who offered the most valuable guidance were typically those who helped others discover their own wisdom rather than imposing external solutions. Rob's unique position allowed him to observe these dynamics with unprecedented clarity, to see how the most effective forms of love and service operated through absence rather than presence, through what was not done rather than what was accomplished, through the creation of space for others to flourish rather than the assertion of one's own importance or capability. His corruption had granted him access to a perspective that revealed the hidden architecture of care and support that made normal life possible, the vast network of unacknowledged contributions that sustained every moment of happiness and growth. This understanding transformed his relationship with his own suffering in ways that were both profound and practical. The pain of isolation and rejection that had once seemed like pure loss, an experience that served no constructive purpose and offered no compensation for the anguish it caused, revealed itself to be the very mechanism that had prepared him for his true vocation. Every moment of exclusion had taught him something essential about the experience of being forgotten. Every rejection had deepened his empathy for others who struggled with feelings of inadequacy and abandonment. Every failure to achieve recognition had strengthened his capacity to find satisfaction in anonymous service. Rob realized that his suffering had been simultaneously meaningless and meaningful, purposeless and purposeful, depending on the framework used to interpret it. Within the conventional narrative structures that governed most characters' understanding of their lives, his pain was indeed senseless, a tragic waste of potential that served no constructive function. But within the larger cosmic order that included invisible as well as visible forms of significance, his suffering had been the necessary preparation for a role that could not have been filled by anyone who had not endured similar experiences. The beauty of this realization lay not in its ability to justify or minimize his pain. Rob understood that suffering was still suffering, regardless of what purposes it might ultimately serve, but in its revelation that even the most apparently meaningless experiences could be transformed through understanding and acceptance into something valuable and life-giving. His anguish had become the raw material from which compassion was constructed. His isolation, the foundation upon which his capacity for selfless service had been built. This transformation of suffering into meaning was not a one-time accomplishment, but an ongoing process that required constant attention and renewal. Rob discovered that the philosophical insights that seemed so clear and compelling during moments of reflection could become clouded or forgotten under the pressures of daily existence, that the peace he had found through understanding could be disrupted by unexpected encounters with old wounds or new forms of disappointment. The discipline of maintaining perspective in the face of these challenges became another aspect of his invisible service to the community. By learning to process his own emotional difficulties without allowing them to interfere with his work as a guardian and guide, Rob was developing skills and insights that would allow him to help others navigate similar struggles. His personal practice of finding meaning within apparent meaninglessness became a form of research that benefited everyone whose lives he touched, even though they would never know the source of the wisdom that indirectly guided his interventions on their behalf. The second major philosophical breakthrough emerged from Rob's growing understanding of the relationship between individual identity and cosmic function. His corruption had initially seemed to represent the dissolution of his essential self, the transformation of whatever coherent identity he had possessed as a forgotten background character into something fragmented and unstable that defied normal categories of existence. But years of living within this altered state had taught him that what he had interpreted as the loss of identity was actually the expansion of identity beyond its conventional boundaries. Normal characters maintain their sense of self through the accumulation of experiences, relationships, and achievements that distinguished them from others, and provided them with unique roles within the social fabric of their community. Their identity was constructed through difference, through the ways in which they were unlike everyone else, through the particular combination of traits and circumstances that made them irreplaceable within specific contexts. Rob's corruption had stripped away most of these conventional markers of identity, leaving him without the clear social position, meaningful relationships, or recognized achievements that typically anchored someone's sense of who they were and what they meant to the world. But in losing these external supports for identity, he had been forced to discover more fundamental aspects of selfhood that existed independent of social recognition or personal circumstance. He began to understand that his essential nature was not diminished by his inability to fit into conventional categories, but was actually revealed by that inability. His identity was not constructed through opposition to others, but through service to others, not through the accumulation of personal distinction, but through the dissolution of the barriers that separated individual welfare from collective well-being. This realization led Rob to a deeper understanding of what philosophers had always meant when they spoke of the illusion of separateness, the false belief that individual consciousness existed in fundamental isolation from the larger systems of which it was a part. His corruption had not destroyed his identity, but had revealed the ways in which individual identity was always already interconnected with everything else, always already dependent on conditions and relationships that extended far beyond the boundaries of personal control or awareness. The peace that came from this understanding was unlike anything Rob had experienced during his years of struggling to establish and maintain a conventional sense of self. Instead of the constant anxiety that accompanied efforts to protect and promote individual identity, he experienced a profound relaxation that came from recognizing that his well-being and the well-being of those around him were not separate concerns, but aspects of a single, larger pattern of health and harmony. This philosophical shift had immediate practical implications for the way Rob approached his work as an invisible guardian. Instead of seeing his interventions as external impositions of his will upon the circumstances of others, he began to understand them as organic expressions of the systemic intelligence that connected all aspects of the community into a coherent whole. His actions emerged not from personal decision-making, but from his sensitivity to the needs and potentials of the larger organism of which he was an integral part. The third, and perhaps most profound insight that emerged from Rob's years of philosophical reflection concerned the nature of love itself and its relationship to recognition, appreciation, and reciprocity. His early understanding of love had been shaped by the conventional models that surrounded him, relationships based on mutual attraction, shared interests, and the exchange of affection between individuals who chose to value each other above others. This transactional model of love had been the source of much of his suffering, because it implied that his inability to attract or maintain such relationships was evidence of his own inadequacy or worthlessness. If love was something that had to be earned through desirable qualities or engaging behaviors, then his isolation was proof that he lacked whatever characteristics were necessary to deserve affection and acceptance. But his years of serving others without hope of recognition or reward had taught Rob that love could exist in forms that transcended transaction entirely, that the deepest and most transformative experiences of caring emerged not from the exchange of benefits between separate individuals, but from the recognition of fundamental interconnection that made such separation illusory in the first place. The love he felt for the community he protected was not based on their appreciation of him or their recognition of his contributions. It was not conditional on their behavior toward him or dependent on their fulfillment of his expectations or desires. It was not even diminished by their complete ignorance of his existence or their inability to remember his name from one encounter to the next. Instead, this love seemed to emerge from something deeper than personal preference or individual choice, from a recognition that the well-being of every character in Elmore was inseparable from his own deepest nature and highest purpose. He could no more stop caring about their happiness and growth than he could stop breathing or thinking, because his love for them had become the very foundation of his identity and the source of whatever meaning his existence possessed. This unconditional love was simultaneously the most natural thing in the world and the most difficult achievement Rob had ever accomplished. It required the constant surrender of every impulse towards self-protection, self-promotion, or self-pity, the ongoing choice to find fulfillment in others' happiness rather than in his own recognition or reward. Yet the difficulty was matched by the profound peace and satisfaction that flowed from aligning his life with this deeper understanding of love's true nature. Rob discovered that the happiness he found in others' well-being was more stable and reliable than any satisfaction he had ever derived from personal achievements or social recognition, because it was based on something that could not be taken away by changing circumstances or other people's opinions. The love that emerged from understanding rather than transaction was also inexhaustible in ways that conventional love could never be. Instead of being depleted by giving, it was actually strengthened by every act of service, every moment of care, every instance of choosing others' needs over his own immediate desires. The more he gave, the more he had to give, as if the universe itself was responding to his willingness to serve by expanding his capacity for service. This inexhaustible quality of unconditional love had practical implications that extended far beyond Rob's personal satisfaction or philosophical understanding. It meant that he could continue his work as an invisible guardian indefinitely without burning out or becoming resentful, that his commitment to protecting and nurturing his community was sustainable across whatever time span might be required. More importantly, it meant that his presence in Elmore served as a kind of stabilizing force that helped maintain the emotional and spiritual climate necessary for healthy community life. Even though no one was consciously aware of his contributions, the consistent flow of unconditional care that he directed toward everyone around him had subtle but significant effects on the overall atmosphere of the town. Rob began to notice that his long-term presence was gradually raising the baseline level of kindness, compassion, and mutual support that characterized interactions between community members. People were becoming slightly more patient with each other, slightly more willing to give others the benefit of the doubt, slightly more inclined to offer help when they saw someone struggling. The changes were too gradual and too subtle to be attributed to any specific cause, but Rob's enhanced perception allowed him to trace their origins to the cumulative effect of years of invisible service motivated by unconditional love. His care for the community was literally changing its fundamental character, creating conditions that supported everyone's growth and development while requiring no acknowledgement or appreciation in return. The final element of Rob's philosophical evolution concerned his understanding of time and its relationship to meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. His early existence had been dominated by a desperate sense of urgency, a feeling that his life was being wasted with every moment that passed without achieving the recognition and belonging he craved. Time had seemed like a finite resource that was constantly running out, making every delay or setback feel like a catastrophic loss of irreplaceable opportunity. But his years of patient service had taught him that the most important forms of meaning operated on timescales that far exceeded individual lifespans or personal ambitions. The work he was doing would not be completed in months or years, but would continue across generations, as the effects of his care rippled outward through the lives he touched to influence people and situations he would never directly encounter. Rob began to understand that his true legacy would not consist of anything he accomplished or achieved in the conventional sense, but of the countless small improvements in others' lives that would continue to generate positive effects long after his own existence had ended. Every intervention that prevented unnecessary suffering, every act that supported someone's growth and development, every moment of care that helped another character feel valued and supported, would echo forward through time in ways that multiplied its original significance. This long-term perspective transformed Rob's relationship with the present moment, allowing him to find profound satisfaction in activities that produced no immediate visible results. He could invest tremendous effort in subtle interventions that might not bear fruit for months or years, secure in the knowledge that the seeds he was planting would eventually grow into something beautiful and beneficial. The patience that grew from this understanding was not passive resignation but active faith, the confidence that his work was meaningful even when its effects remained invisible, that his care was valuable even when it went unrecognized, that his love was worthwhile even when it was not reciprocated. In embracing this eternal perspective, Rob had finally found the peace that had eluded him throughout his long journey from forgotten character to failed villain to invisible guardian. He belonged not just to the immediate community of Elmore, but to the larger community of all beings who had ever chosen to serve others without hope of reward, all those who had found meaning through the surrender of personal ambition in favor of unconditional love. His existence had become simultaneously insignificant and infinitely meaningful, forgotten and unforgettable, isolated and completely connected to everything that mattered most in the vast, beautiful, broken world that had finally given him a way to call it home. And so we reach the end of our long meditation on the life and transformation of Rob, that strange and melancholy figure who began as nothing more than a glitch in the margins of reality and became something approaching a saint of the forgotten and the overlooked. His journey from the grey emptiness of the void to the invisible guardianship of Elmore represents one of the most profound explorations of meaning and purpose that any consciousness has ever undertaken. A pilgrimage through suffering and rejection toward a form of love so pure and selfless that it transcends every conventional understanding of what it means to care for others. The eternal cycle that now defines Rob's existence is both beautiful and heartbreaking in its perfect simplicity. Each day brings new opportunities to serve without recognition, to heal without credit, to love without hope of reciprocation. He has become the eternal outsider who makes belonging possible for everyone else, the perpetual stranger whose presence creates the safety and stability that allows others to build homes and families and communities without ever knowing how fragile those blessings truly are. In accepting his role as the keeper of difficult truths and the guardian of uncomfortable realities, Rob has achieved something that few beings ever accomplish: the complete transcendence of personal desire in favor of universal compassion. He exists now not for himself, but for everyone who has ever felt forgotten, everyone who has ever struggled with the terrible weight of insignificance, everyone who has ever wondered whether their life has any meaning beyond the recognition they receive from others. His story reminds us that the most important work is often invisible, that the greatest love asks nothing in return, and that meaning can be found even in the spaces between acknowledgement and oblivion. In learning to embrace the paradox of his existence, simultaneously essential and ignored, powerful and powerless, meaningful and meaningless, Rob has become a living testament to the possibility of finding peace within contradiction, rather than struggling endlessly against the fundamental absurdity of conscious existence. As you drift towards sleep, let Rob's journey accompany you into dreams where the boundaries between self and other dissolve, where service becomes its own reward, and where love finally reveals its true nature as something that exists not because it is deserved or earned, but because consciousness itself is too beautiful and precious to be left unprotected in the vast darkness that surrounds us. All rest now in the knowledge that somewhere in the spaces between stories, someone watches over the watchers, cares for the carers, and remembers those who have been forgotten by everyone else.